It was Saturday night at Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison. Shortly before 9 p.m., the facility's most dangerous and high-profile inmate stepped into the shower in his cell. He never came out. This escape had been in the works for a long time. He knew that the cameras in solitary confinement recorded him around the clock. The one place surveillance didn't reach was the shower stall. A narrow hole had been cut there, leading straight to a tunnel. He lowered himself through the opening. Inside, a ladder dropped 30 feet down to a main tunnel. An accomplice met him there with a motorcycle rigged to run on a track laid on the tunnel's floor. The route stretched nearly for a mile. At the far end, they climbed up through a shaft and surfaced inside an unfinished house. When guards finally decided to check the cell, they found the hole in the shower and no inmate. The only living creature that remained in the cell was a sparrow. Members of the cartel had used birds to test the tunnel's air. The elusive drug kingpin had escaped again. Joaquín Guzmán, better known as El Chapo, was one of the most famous drug kingpins in history. Many people in Mexico considered him more powerful than the government. By some estimates, he was responsible for tens of thousands of killings. Authorities had been trying to arrest him for decades. A few times they succeeded. But more often, El Chapo managed to slip away. This 2015 escape included. And it wasn't the end of a 30-year saga. This is the story of a manhunt for the uncatchable kingpin. Social networks were on the rise in the 2010s, and rich people loved posting evidence of their wealth. Plenty of young members of Mexican cartels were no exception. Online, they displayed lavish parties, gold-plated weapons, stacks of cash, exotic animals, expensive cars, and even drugs that were the source of their decadent and usually short lives. There was a saying in cartel circles that one good year is better than 10 bad ones. But the leader of one of Mexico's biggest and most powerful cartels had a different philosophy. He was 57 and he valued secrecy. He spent much of his time in hiding in the mountains of Sinaloa, the state where he was born and where he ran his criminal empire. By 2014, Joaquín Guzmán, better known as El Chapo, was considered the most wanted fugitive on the planet. His Sinaloa cartel was responsible for roughly half of all drug trafficking across the southern US border. For Guzmán, it had taken nearly 30 years to build the empire. Mystery is a crucial ingredient of a larger-than-life reputation. For a long time, only a handful of photographs of Joaquín Guzmán circulated publicly. One of the earliest was taken in 1993 after his arrest. By then, he was a young cartel leader on the rise, and the photo has a story behind it. Guzmán was born in the late 50s in a mountain village in the Mexican state of Sinaloa. His father was a farmer who also dabbled in the drug trade. As the oldest child, Guzmán was pulled out of elementary school to help his parents with the harvest. A lack of education didn't slow his criminal career. He became an apprentice to a powerful cartel leader. He began by coordinating drug flights from Colombia. El Chapo meant shorty, but despite his nickname, he aimed high. He was street smart, ambitious, and aggressive, and he started to acquire power quickly. By the end of the 1980s, he was one of the cartel's leaders. A disco bar in the Mexican coastal city of Puerto Vallarta was crowded. Some of Guzmán's henchmen severed the building's telephone lines so no one could call for help. Then they entered the discotheque. Their targets were rival traffickers, men El Chapo wanted to challenge for the smuggling routes to the United States. Guzmán's people opened fire, killing 6. But their targets were in the bathroom. Hearing the gunshots and the screams, they slipped away unharmed. The next spring, in 1993, his rivals returned the favor. Guzmán was at the airport in Guadalajara. Hitmen were waiting. When the shooting began, El Chapo jumped out of his vehicle and survived. 7 bystanders were killed, including a prominent Mexican archbishop. The massacre ignited a political scandal. El Chapo went into hiding. He was caught in Guatemala and extradited to Mexico. That's when the famous photograph was taken. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison on charges of drug trafficking and bribery. He was sent to Puente Grande, one of the most secure prisons in western Mexico. He stayed there only 8 years. Even behind bars, he lived in luxury: lobsters for dinner and prostitutes for entertainment. More importantly, he kept running his business from his cell, and in those 8 years, his reputation and his empire grew exponentially. In January 2001, guards found Guzmán's cell empty. According to the official investigation, he'd hidden inside a laundry cart and was smuggled out by an accomplice. But it was widely understood that he had bought off prison authorities, which meant he might just as easily have walked out through the front door. For the next few years, authorities tried hard to capture Guzmán, but only twice did they come close. In 2004, El Chapo was hiding on a ranch in Sinaloa. Mexican soldiers descended there to arrest him. Guzmán, tipped off in advance, fled into the mountains. In 2007, Guzmán married for the 3rd time. He threw a huge party. Half the Mexican criminal world seemed to be on the guest list. The Mexican army arrived by helicopters to crash the celebration. But by the time the troops got there, he was gone. He knew they were coming. One of El Chapo's advantages was the level of corruption in Mexico. Guzmán bought off people in the authorities and the police. The US Drug Enforcement Administration could collect intelligence on his activities and whereabouts, but it had no jurisdiction to make arrests on Mexican territory. So agents fed leads to their Mexican counterparts, and again El Chapo vanished before the army arrived. There was another deterrent: fear. People in the criminal world understood that going against Guzmán wasn't just dangerous for you, it could be dangerous for your family. By some estimates, El Chapo was responsible for tens of thousands of killings over the course of his career. The other valuable tool that helped Guzmán avoid arrest was total secrecy. He spent most of his time moving between multiple properties in the mountains of Sinaloa, protected by hundreds of guards. As long as he stayed in that inhospitable terrain, Mexican authorities had little chance of catching him. In a rare night, when he decided to go out to have a quiet meal in a city restaurant, he followed a strict choreography of precautions. His guards entered first and, politely but persistently, demanded that the other diners surrender their phones. When El Chapo finished eating, the guards returned the devices and the group left as quickly as it had arrived. Phones and communication were always a priority for Guzmán. His business depended on a constant exchange of messages across a long chain of production and supply. The cartel operated with a sophisticated cellular structure with many different compartments. It resembled a terrorist organization more than a traditional mafia. Because of that structure, Guzmán communicated directly with only a handful of close subordinates. Many important cartel members never spoke to him at all. Although the DEA tapped hundreds of traffickers' phone lines and email accounts, getting to Guzmán himself close enough to arrest him remained extraordinarily difficult. By the end of the 2000s, the Kingpin had developed a reputation for being uncatchable. El Chapo preferred BlackBerry phones. Among cartel members, there was a popular belief that these devices were safer for communication, thanks to encryption and to the fact that company was Canadian and not American. But in 2012, the DEA managed to get access to Guzmán's BlackBerry. The hide-and-seek game began. In February, Guzmán was planning to visit a prostitute in Los Cabos. By then, he had been married 3 times, he had many mistresses, and he still loved paid companionship. The DEA traced the Kingpin's phone. Agents believed he was inside a luxury mansion near the coast. Mexican soldiers broke in through the front door. El Chapo was already gone. He'd likely been warned in advance. He slipped out through the back door and tried to thread his way toward the mountains through the crowded city streets. Officers kept pursuing him by the phone signal. Eventually, El Chapo realized the device might be tapped. Along the way, he met a cartel member and handed over the BlackBerry. Then he drove off in another direction. The authorities didn't know about the switch and stayed locked onto the signal. In the end, they caught the man with the BlackBerry, only to learn he wasn't El Chapo. Guzmán headed into the desert. There, he transferred to a private plane and flew back to the safety of the mountains of Sinaloa. After that, his communication became even more limited. If Guzmán needed to send or receive a message, it became a slow, layered process. One trusted lieutenant received a message, then passed it to another lieutenant using public Wi-Fi. The same step repeated again and again before El Chapo ever saw the message. And still, after a while, the DEA cracked the system. Also, they arrested several people from Guzmán's close circle. Once again, they could locate him. After so many failed attempts to arrest the notorious Kingpin, Mexican authorities decided to change tactics. They assembled a special unit of Mexican Marines called CIMAR. These men could move faster than the regular army and more quietly. Only a handful of commanders knew about future missions. The Marines learned the final target just days before an operation began. During that period, they surrendered their phones. It kept the risk of a leak close to zero. In 2014, CIMAR prepared to launch its most ambitious mission yet, Operation Gargoyle. The goal was to capture Guzmán. When El Chapo spent time in the city to visit restaurants or women, he rarely stayed 2 nights in a row in the same place. The DEA learned one of the Guzmán's addresses in the city of Culiacán, and CIMAR prepared to storm the house. A few Marines grabbed a battering ram and went for the front door. It barely moved. It turned out this wasn't an ordinary door. It was custom-made, filled with water inside. A typical steel door heats up by the friction of a battering ram and becomes more pliable. Here, the water absorbed the heat. The door held. The Marines hit again and again. After almost 10 minutes, they finally broke inside. They checked every room. The house was empty. In the bathroom, they found something strange. The bathtub had been raised from its base at a 45-degree angle. Beneath, It was a dark hall with a set of stairs. It led to a tunnel. When the Marines began storming the house, El Chapo was still inside with a few of his men. Hearing the ram hammering the door, they moved quickly. Guzmán and a bodyguard went to the bathroom. He pressed a hidden button beside the mirror. A mechanism lifted the bathtub to 45 degrees, revealing the hole in the floor. El Chapo and his bodyguard climbed down. In the narrow space, they moved as fast as they could. They knew the Marines would break through at any moment. Guzmán's feet were bleeding. He hadn't had time to pull on shoes when the raid began, so he was barefoot. They reached the point where the tunnel connected to the city's sewer system. Now they were inside a huge pipe, dark, filthy, with water running along the bottom. By the time the Marines entered the tunnel, their target was already far ahead. On the surface, dozens of their colleagues searched the streets. Above them, American drones scanned the city. Eventually, the Marines reached the tunnel's end and emerged onto the bank of the muddy river. No one was there. The elusive Kingpin had proved the point. He had escaped. Again. Nowadays, tunnels run beneath the US-Mexican border. Like invisible veins, they feed the drug trade. The mastermind of this system was Joaquín Guzmán. Tunnels were one of the key factors in his rise. He came up with the concept in the 80s, before his first arrest. Back then, Guzmán was young, energetic, and already making so much money he didn't know where to keep it. He hired an architect to build secret compartments under the floors of his houses. Some of these mansions sat close to the US border, and Guzmán had a simple idea. If you can't dig down under your own living room, why not keep digging under the border itself? The US was the main market for his criminal enterprise. The first tunnel ended at a warehouse in Arizona owned by the cartel. The practice proved so successful that by the mid-2010s, US authorities attributed almost 100 cross-border tunnels to the Sinaloa cartel. And these weren't just narrow holes in the dirt, they were almost a marvel of engineering. 1 or 2 miles long, with air conditioning and electricity, drainage system, and tracks for moving carts. In other words, Guzmán could have updated his nickname to El Tunnel. After the last escape, Mexican Marines searched the scene. That's when they realized the tunnel under the house didn't just connect to the sewer system, it connected to 6 other houses in Culiacán, the capital of the state of Sinaloa. Because of the massive CIMAR search operation, El Chapo had trouble making his way back to the mountains. Authorities knew it was nearly impossible to trace Guzmán's own phone, so they focused on his inner circle. In the days after the escape, the DEA caught the signal of one of his bodyguards. They traced it to the port city of Mazatlan, a resort popular with American and Canadian tourists and an important hub for the Sinaloa cartel's business. The signal led to a luxury hotel on the Pacific coast. Early Saturday morning, Marines took positions around the building. The operation began. Hotel managers said that only 2 suites had been rented the previous day. When the Marines entered the suite on the 6th floor, they found a few American tourists recovering from a night of heavy drinking. At the same moment, another CIMAR team burst into an apartment on the 4th floor. There they found the bodyguard whose phone they had traced. He and a handful of colleagues were armed, but they didn't resist. They were badly outnumbered. To move fast, El Chapo traveled with a small team. In the next room, they found Guzmán himself, along with his wife and their 2-year-old twins. He surrendered without a fight. Afterward, they transported El Chapo to Mexico City. At the airport, photographers took what would become the most famous images of him: dark jeans, a white shirt, escorted by Mexican Marines. El Chapo was calm and polite. He told his captors he'd planned to flee to the mountains the next day. "Can't believe you caught me," he said. Within hours, Mexico's president, Peña Nieto, announced the arrest on Twitter. For years, the country's leaders had promised to fight the cartels. The results were modest at best. It was no surprise that many people even didn't believe the man in custody was the notorious kingpin. Almost nobody had seen El Chapo in decades, and his reputation for slipping away was so entrenched that it was hard to imagine the story ending any other way. Authorities ran tests to confirm his identity. DNA and fingerprints proved they had in fact arrested El Chapo. Now the main question was, how long could the Mexican authorities keep him behind bars? Given the history of Guzmán's escapes and the country's corruption problem, the United States pushed for the extradition, hoping to prosecute him there. Mexico's Attorney General responded quickly. The country had no intention of handing him over. Guzmán still had the remainder of his first 20-year sentence to serve, and the new accusations were even more severe. There was also a moral argument for keeping him in Mexico. Nobody knew exactly how many people had become Guzmán's victims. Even the most modest estimates put it in the thousands, killed or disappeared by El Chapo personally or by his subordinates. A more realistic number was tens of thousands. Drug trafficking is a bloody business, and most of Guzmán's victims were Mexican. So why should he be tried anywhere else? Mexican authorities promised that they would not allow El Chapo to escape again. The embarrassment of 2001 would not be repeated. Well, it was repeated. The first time Guzmán went to prison, he stayed 8 years. This time, only about 1. In the beginning, everything looked promising. El Chapo was sent to Altiplano, Mexico's most secure prison not far from the capital. In his small solitary cell, cameras recorded him around the clock. It seemed like the notorious kingpin was destined to stay there for the rest of his life. Guzmán had another idea. He began planning his escape almost from day one. El Chapo was allowed visits not only from his lawyers, but also from his wife Emma Coronel. That was a little surprising because it was well known that she wasn't just aware of his business, she participated in it. Emma became a crucial link between Guzmán and the cartel's people on the outside. For the escape, El Chapo returned to what he knew best: tunnels. First, his people bought an unfinished house about a mile from the Altiplano prison. To keep the tunnel on course, Guzmán's accomplices smuggled a GPS watch into his cell. The tunnel, like so many others tied to his name, was an engineering achievement. It ran nearly a mile under the prison's fortified perimeter and ended in the one spot in El Chapo's cell the cameras couldn't see: the shower stall. The tunnel had electricity, ventilation, spare oxygen canisters, and a motorcycle rigged to run on a track laid on the tunnel's floor. As the digging closed in, other inmates could hear it. Some complained to prison authorities about the noise, but their complaints were not heard. Building the tunnel took more than a year and nearly $5 million. In July 2015, Guzmán stepped into the shower, squeezed himself through the opening, and met one of his men below, waiting with the motorcycle. It took guards 18 minutes to check the cell and find the tunnel. By then, El Chapo was already far away. He surfaced in the unfinished house, climbed into an SUV, and was driven to a small airstrip. From there, he flew to safety, to one of his ranches in the mountains of Sinaloa. Once again, Joaquín Guzmán had done what he was famous for. A week later, he had a meeting with his inner circle. They discussed their business. After his first escape in 2001, El Chapo remained free for more than a decade. In that time, he reached new heights of wealth and power. Many people in Mexico assumed that this time wouldn't be different, that authorities would spend years trying to catch him again. But between 2001 and 2015, Mexican and American law enforcement agencies made real progress. They learned how to find kingpins' whereabouts more effectively. Guzmán still needed some communication with his team to run the business. That was the weakness. The DEA kept tracking the phones of people close to him. This time, agents believed they would get him, and soon. Early one morning, a team of Marines from Simar took positions outside a mansion in a small town in the state of Sinaloa. A battering ram struck the door, and the sound shattered the silence. After the seventh swing, the Marines broke in. They rushed the rooms. Gunfire erupted, explosions shook the building. A few people fell to the floor. The Simar team moved quickly, first floor, then second. Some of Guzmán's men were dead, others were in handcuffs. But the main target, the short, stocky man with dark hair, wasn't there. At the moment the Marines began the assault, El Chapo and one of his guards slipped into a closet and descended into a tunnel. They surfaced in public across the street from a Walmart. Then they hijacked a car and drove away. It looked like the trick had worked again. But this time it didn't. Police stopped the car. The two men inside were detained before the Marines arrived. After the escape in 2015, everything felt like déjà vu. El Chapo was sent back to Altiplano. His accomplices again bought a piece of land near the prison walls. Workers began digging. But this time Guzmán didn't stay there alone. He was transferred to another prison. His people tried to bribe officials to bring him back to Altiplano. They spent millions of dollars. It didn't work. El Chapo wasn't aware that preparation for his extradition had begun even before his last arrest. In January 2017, agents put him on a private jet. He probably assumed he was being moved to another Mexican prison. When the plane landed and he saw the airport, he understood this was American soil. El Chapo's worst fear had come true. 2 years later, Joaquín Guzmán stood in a US courtroom to speak his last words and hear his sentence: life in prison plus 30 years. Now he is serving his time in a secure prison in the desert of Colorado. He will almost certainly spend the rest of his life there. For El Chapo, the chances of planning and executing an escape from an American prison are close to zero. So, what did the end of the uncatchable drug lord mean for the business he helped build? Almost nothing. If you remove the CEO of Apple, company will still sell phones. It will simply appoint a new CEO and keep going. People still need phones. Guzmán's legend outgrew the man himself. It's not surprising that for years he negotiated with Hollywood producers to sell the rights to his story. His life looked like a movie. But in reality, El Chapo wasn't the most powerful or the wealthiest Mexican kingpin. He was one in a long line of big drug lords. Famous, but replaceable. It has been almost 10 years since he became a prisoner in the United States. In 2025, Mexican cartels are still responsible for the vast majority of drugs coming through the southern border. And one of the main players remains the Sinaloa cartel, now led by others.